Ajax. Many people know how it got its name, but few realize just how and why it came into being. The reminders are still with us today. The steam plant, a number of warehouses, and local businesses. But these are just a few of the scattered remains of what was once the largest shell-filling plant in the British Empire. This program will illustrate the contribution of those people who came to work for Defense Industries Limited, and more importantly, how they contributed to the uniqueness of our community. Prior to 1941, Ajax didn't exist. It was only a scattering of farms and pastures. Little did the people there know how dramatically the landscape was to change just a short 2 years after the beginning of World War II. The first few years of the war were desperate for the Allies. The Germans had made good on their promise of conquering Europe. If Britain was to survive, it would need the help of its allies and colonies around the globe. In this, Canada played a leading role. Largely an agricultural nation, Canada would transform itself into an industrial one. One such place to feel that transformation was a large portion of farmland in the small rural community of Pickering. Ken Smith, author of the book Ajax: The War Years, a former councillor and mayor, and a former employee of DIL, outlines the reasons Ajax was chosen as the site for the plant.
Ajax was chosen as a site for Defense Industries Limited because they had the area to spread out the production lines so that an explosion in one line would not interfere with or damage a second line, and primarily because it had the space that was required, the acreage required, it had the water supply, it had a sewage disposal location, it had the transportation with the rail line running by. It had the 401 highway, which was incomplete at that time. It had number 2 highway. As a transportation link, it had close proximity to Toronto, which supplied the raw materials that they required. It wasn't too far from Nobel, the explosive site near Parry Sound, where they got a lot of their material. It had many, many factors which made it a very desirable spot to locate a shell-filling plant.
Once the site was chosen, the federal government immediately implemented plans to expropriate the land from the local farmers. Over 2,800 acres of land would be bought, stretching from Lake Ontario to land just north of Highway 401. Apparently, the terms of that expropriation were quite simple.
Yes, the government sent out a sheet, a legal-sized sheet, notifying the farmers, landowners, that they would be expropriating the land and the purposes for which it was needed. And I believe that they noted a price on it per acre. I was talking to Ken Powell, Vernon Powell, who was one of the former landowner's sons very recently, and he told me the average price was $100 per acre that was paid for the land by the federal government. But the expropriation procedure was that simple. Of course, behind the scenes there was all the registrations and the legal work to be done, but the terms were very simple.
As soon as the land was bought and surveyed, construction began in earnest. The land to the north of Highway 401 was reserved for housing the workers that would soon arrive, while the land south of the new highway, still being built and only a gravel road, was predominantly plant property and reserved for the business of shell filling. Due to the rapid nature of construction, steam lines were above ground and traveled miles to the production lines. The lines were spread out for safety reasons. Near the lake, buildings would be constructed to store the shells prior to shipping. Again, these were spread out to prevent a catastrophic accident. Rail lines would ship shells to and from the plant and even carry the shells within the plant itself. All this would take place in less than a year.
I think it was quite a marvelous feat to construct Defense Industries Limited as quickly as they did in as short a time. They did it in less than a year and had it in production, practically all of it. In that time, they had some of it in production in about 3 to 4 months, from February until August. They were shipping material to Britain by plane from the cap and det lines. It was light material, it was caps and detonators. But I think it was just actually a marvelous thing that they were able to construct it as quickly as they did, with buildings going up and roads and steam lines, electrical lines, all those things that had to be coordinated, and they didn't have any accidents or any great delays. Now, mind you, there was no end to the cost of it. It was cost plus, so they had every encouragement to build it as quickly as they could, and it didn't matter how much money was thrown into it, because the more money that went into it, the more the contractor got back in his commission.
By the spring of 1941, a bustling industrial town had its beginnings, almost overnight. But now it needed people. Alex Russell, fresh from General Motors, headed up the personnel department that would be responsible for hiring the 9,000 plus employees needed to work at DIL. One of the first to arrive in July of 1941 was Joyce Shell, now Mrs. Joyce Chalmers.
Well, for me, we came here in 1941, before Ajax ever had a name. My father worked for Carter Hall Construction Company building an airport in Moose Jaw, and then they had the contract to build this shell filling plant down here. He came down in April of that year, and we came down after school had finished in July. And he was still with the construction company, and Defense Industries wasn't really active yet. They were hiring people, so I applied for a job, and they didn't have an opening for me at the time. The only people there were the works manager, the personnel manager, and the employment office itself, and they were busy interviewing people for the plant. And then I got a call, and I went to my first job there, August the 1st. I worked for the safety engineer and Major Dunn, the security officer. And then as the work increased, they hired another secretary for the safety engineer, and I went to the security office full-time. And we became very busy and hired one additional girl and another one until we had a security staff just in the office of 6 or 7 girls.
Well, the main job of security was to investigate the people that were hired. And as they were hired, on their application form, they would give 2 references. And our main job was contacting these references. And we also contacted the RCMP and the OPP. And if there was anything negative, like a jail record or anything like that, then they were let go.
Larry Klein, a Winnipeg native just out of the Army, was glad to be working at DIL for a very special reason.
My sister wrote me, sister-in-law, that there was lots of work up here. Of course, my brother-in-law, her brother, sent me my fare. I was broke then. And I booked in for a job at DIL, and finally I got called. But get this, I was so damn happy to get a job. I was almost running down the hall with the little trucks going around the corners. They had mirrors stuck in the corner of the building, you see, so you could see around the corner who was coming in. I meet this guy. He said, "What the heck are you smiling about?" He says, I said, "So." I said, "I got a job." And got a job right there on the line, pouring TNT. Yeah. Of course, you had to give them your history, though. They had to know who in the heck you were who was working there. Yeah, I was glad to get in there for, you know, to help in the war. I always thought to myself, at least I'm still fighting. Yeah, that was my attitude.
Although most of the labor could be found in nearby communities, it soon became clear that more labor was needed if production goals were to be met. Alex Russell and Cease Robinson led that search for more employees outside Ontario, into Saskatchewan and the Maritimes. One person to answer the call was Louise Johnson from Saskatoon. She tells us of the long train journey that many made to work at DIL.
Oh, that was an exciting thing. Auntie packed me a great big lunch and said, you won't be able to get any food on the train, you know, and dress warmly. And those were two wise pieces of advice. So the train was to leave at the station at 5 o'clock in the morning, and so Uncle thought it would be better if he took me in my trunk before he went to bed. So we did that, and I checked into the train late night. And so I was on the train quite a few hours before we ever pulled out of the station. So we set out, and I don't know how many people have traveled across the country by train. It's gorgeous. Canada is a beautiful country, but trains always take the back road, through the bush, behind the houses. So there's not, we saw a lot of scenery, but it gets kind of boring after a while, particularly when you have no place to lie down and the day passes into night. And they did bring along a pillow and I think a blanket. Other than that, we were pretty well on our own. Didn't know anyone else on the train. I didn't know anyone that was coming here. Someplace they picked up coaches full of servicemen. And for 4 or 5 hours, things were really interesting until the people in charge got wise and made the girls coaches out of bounds. And the things were pretty dull after that. We arrived here in November, and we came from a climate that was cold, very cold, and very dry. I was adequately dressed for that climate with a warm winter coat and something that we called leg warmers, which were wool jobbies that came up above the knee here to keep your legs warm. And women didn't wear slacks a great deal. And so, and warm boots and everything. Well, I brought all those clothes with me. When I got here, it was kind of damp and dingy, and we had a tough time getting used to this climate. And all these nice warm clothes I had for minus 30 simply wouldn't do this minus 5 sort of stuff. And I'm talking Fahrenheit because we used Fahrenheit in those days. And anyhow, it was chilly and damp, and we had a heck of a time getting used to the climate. And Christmas Day, you remember we left, I came in November, and so the first Christmas was probably the saddest day of our lives. And guess what? It was raining. The grass was green, what grass there was, and it was raining. And here we are, the three of us, the three musketeers. The girl I roomed with was Dorothy, so we called her Dot, and the other girl was Dorothy, so we called her Dorothy, so we didn't get confused. And me being Louise wasn't a problem. So the three of us are out trudging in the rain with our umbrella, and if you ever saw 3 more miserable people in your life.
Louise first arrived and lived in the women's residence. Her future husband, Russell Johnson, lived in the men's residence. Now, these were mainly for single people, but whole families came from all over Canada to work at DIL. Once construction of the plant was completed, carpenters began building the housing north of the 401.
The first section was built from what is now Harwood Avenue over to Windsor, and from Harwood Avenue over to Glynn Road in 1942. The western section was built in 1943. But as soon as those houses were ready, people started moving in. And we came in September 1942. And we were happy to have a place of our own after living in a larger shared home. And it was a nice home. We did have, everybody had black kitchen stoves. There were no basements. We heated with the kitchen stove and the living room stove, burned wood and coal, and everybody did the same thing because there was nothing else available during the war. And it took a while to landscape your yard. We had some nice muddy streets to contend with. Sometimes when it rained, things were really rough. It was just as well that there was only one car, usually to a family. After all, gas was rationed. Everybody used the public bus service to go out of town. The streets were not paved before the houses were built, as they are nowadays. But we survived.
Arlene and Bert Shannon, only children when they first came to Ajax, remember what it was like moving into the newly constructed war homes.
Well, we come from Oshawa, my mom and dad, and 11 children. When we moved into our house on Durham Street in the North Village, it wasn't even finished. They had moved us to the wrong house. But we stayed there, and the workmen worked around 11 kids. And my dad was on security. And my mom, eventually, she got a job working on the line. But when we moved on to Durham Street, it was just before Halloween, and we got dressed up to go out on Halloween, and there was only one other family on the street. They lived at the other end. That was the extent of our trick-or-treating on Halloween. I'll never forget that.
I was really quite pleased with it because as little as there was in this town, there wasn't that much more in Brighton. Sure, Brighton had a business district, but to a boy of my age at that time, that meant really nothing, you know. And coming into Ajax, you got into a new school, sports. There was, believe it or not, I believe there was more to do here than there was in the town that I left, Brighton. And I was quite pleased about it. As I said, the school was new and the house was new, and there was just no comparison, really. The fact that there wasn't even any grass laid. There were no sidewalks. There were boardwalks rather than sidewalks. I had never seen anything like it before.
When we return, we'll examine the importance of work at DIL, the tightness of security, and hear the watchword for the day, safety.
It was in the top 3 most dangerous plants on the continent, but it was also in the top 3 for safety.
I hope you're enjoying the documentary Ajax the War Years. The funds to produce this program were provided by Maclean Hunter Cable TV as part of our 25th anniversary celebrations. In 1968, Maclean Hunter Cable TV first came to Ajax. Since that time, both us and the community have grown in many ways. But one thing we will always remember is we could not have got here without your help. From all the staff at Maclean Hunter Cable TV, we'd like to say thank you.
Work at DIL was laborious, dangerous, and tedious. 3 shifts of over 9,000 workers toiled 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, to fill the 40 million shells needed to win the war. Getting to work was only half the fun. Kelly Bowen tells us how everyone banded together to get to work on time.
We used to hitchhike from Bowmanville, and we'd get to the top of Harwood Avenue and number 2 and get out and run across, and then if we were lucky, there was they used to call them cattle cars, because that's what they were like, just load the cattle in. Well, that's what you felt like, because I'm telling you, I can remember, so get a lunch pail in your back or tromped on, you were just jammed in. And if they said it's full, you know darn well there was room for 10 more anyway. Pack them in there, and we'd ride from there down to the plant, to the main gate. Or if there were no buses there, we'd just start running, and somebody'd come by and peep the horn, and we'd pile into their car. Some of them are a memory. You didn't know who they were or anything, but they were all helping. They were all getting us to work on time, and it was you felt like you were a part of a big team. It was a wonderful experience.
Cattle cars took the employees to the many production lines set up to perform a variety of tasks, from cordite tying and weighing to TNT testing and cap and dent. Much of the work was labor-intensive, dangerous, and boring. And all this for a wage that was at the time high, considering the dangers of the job. Louise Johnson.
I believe that the pay could have varied depending on where you were working. As I recall, I started out at 54 cents an hour, and that was when I was working in shell filling. In line 3, I filled the shells with cordite. That would be the casing end. And line 3 made a 3.7, filled a 3.7 shell. And so it had a tall brass casing which had to be filled with explosive. So we filled it with cordite bundles, which were yay big around. Reminded us a little bit of spaghetti. And those bundles had to be weighed and tied to the exact amount of explosive that was required. So there were groups of girls in rooms weighing and tying the cordite.
When we were starting cordite, they wanted us to keep our hair covered completely, so there would be no sparks, coming off our hair or the electricity. And of course, all the girls didn't think too much of that because we certainly didn't look very pleasant to look at. But in time, we were able to let our hair show, but we still had to wear the bandana, as we called it. Then, if you couldn't take off our rings, they made sure we had the rings covered up with tape for fear of sparks from our diamonds, So they would not let us wear them unless the rings were taped. The guard didn't do that. It was our foreman that would notice that.
Ken McCrae, now retired from General Motors, was hired on by Alex Russell to be a foreman on pellet and tracer. Only at DIL for a year, he returned to GM to help make the Mosquito and stayed there until his retirement. The foreman kept a watchful eye on everything that went on.
Well, you had to be responsible for the ones that worked for you and that they did the right job and do it right the first time. You didn't have any choices. You had to be right. I mean, there was no second business about it. I mean, if there was something if a pellet wasn't the right size, it's discarded. They'd take them out and they'd dispose of them, you see. You wouldn't have anything that was wrong. Like, it had to be right. You had tolerances you had to be right within as far as weight and dimension. They had to be right. And that's the way they had to be in order to fire properly. You didn't want any duds when you were shooting a gun. You wanted to be sure that it was hitting.
Each line had its own job to do, and line 3 was producing 3.7 shells. So they're tall fellows, stand about this high, and the casing, then the casing end, about so perhaps, and that casing was filled with cordite, and the cordite came into us in a box, and it looked like white spaghetti, somewhat. Anyhow, it was about the size of a pencil, a little smaller than a pencil, and solid and white, and about that long, I suppose. So you dug in there with the things you were supplied with were gloves and a cutting knife. So when you were weighing, you dipped in and you got a handful of cordite and you put it on a scale. Now these scales were calibrated by inspectors. You didn't have to go 2 pounds 4 ounces. You went to the black line. And that they were very carefully checked every so often. The inspectors would come in and check again. So you didn't ever have to know how much it weighed. That wasn't important. What you had to do was get it to the black line. So it took no skill, actually. It was very boring. But you know, we sang songs and told yarns and anything at all to stay awake. Have you ever tried to stay awake at 3 o'clock in the morning and watch the black line, up to the black line, please, you know? Pretty tricky.
Another woman working in Cordite and called upon to utilize her singing skills was Jenny Fowler of Whitby. She remembers that her co-workers had some unexpected help in their choir practice.
When we were working on the midnight shift and around 2 or 3 o'clock, when we start seeing the eyes starting to fall there, they'd suddenly say, "Jenny, you better start singing there." So I would start singing the songs that I knew, and the others would join in with me. And I got to learn how to sing with someone like you and smile a while and keep the home fires burning. So Mr. McCrae would be sweeping the hallway, and he was our sweeper, and he would gradually sweep his way into our room there, and he'd get behind me. And with 40 women, he was the only man that could, you know, he harmonized beautifully, and he had such a big voice. It just, oh, I don't know, it did something to you. So then we'd sing song after song after song till we ran out of songs, eh? And then we'd be awake for a while and then start tying cordite and talk, and Mr. McCrae would go back into the hallway and finish his sweeping. But it seemed every time we'd start a sing-song, we could see him creeping into our room there, and he had a beautiful voice.
Safety and security at DIL was paramount. Everywhere there were constant reminders to be safe. Over the front gate, huge signs reminded everyone just how important safety was.
It was very risky taking a match or a cigarette in with you. It was very bad. And if you were caught, like when you went in, the policewomen would check you, and if you were caught with matches, the first time you would be warned and they would take it away from you. But the next time, and if you were found with it, you were definitely let go. You were warned once, and they said that you know, you wouldn't be able to work here again. So whether that happened, I don't know, but we were warned, because it is risky taking, you know, matches down with cordite and TNT and explosives. But there'd always be the odd one that thought they could get away with it, but we were checked pretty good when we were going through the gates.
When you went through to work, you had to be wearing your badge. Now, to get this badge, when we came here to be on payroll, we were given a payroll number, we were given a medical, we were fingerprinted, and our picture was taken. And then without this badge, we needed to wear it here. You couldn't get into work. And the people who were walking in, of course, and most of us walked in, and punched the time clock, we had to go past guards always.
The security was very, very strict, very organized, and had no real problems. The outside of the plant was surrounded by high fences with barbed wire, and guards were on duty 24 hours a day, and it was so organized that every guard on patrol always had in sight one guard ahead of him and one guard behind. Now, for other aspects of security, it was in the top 3 most dangerous plants on the continent, but it was also in the top 3 for safety. Our safety engineer was absolutely the best. Even in offices, we had white lines, and you walked on your side of the white line. You couldn't even run into anybody coming around a corner. Now, for going inside, employees were searched. They were not allowed to take in matches and cigarettes or liquor or anything like that. And once in a while, somebody would sneak in a cigarette or a match or something like that. But it was a rare, rare thing. Everybody thought too much of themselves to take any chances.
Yeah, they used to have these little buildings for lighting cigarettes. To light your cigarette, have a smoke before you went in. So everybody 15 minutes earlier would come in, have a smoke and put the cigarette out. That was it. Didn't carry anything with them. And this time I brought a package of Woodbine cigarettes from England. Geez, I'm going to keep those for a souvenir. And apparently I still had them, and they were still pretty good cigarettes because I wasn't too long from overseas. Well, I just kept them in the cupboards here somewhere. Anyway, I had them in my pocket that day, not even thinking of smoking. I wouldn't think of smoking in the plant. The guard caught me. He searched me and pulled out everything out of my pocket. There's their darn cigarettes. He says, day off. Well, he just didn't say it that way, but the orders were, you have day off when you're carrying cigarettes like that.
Safety was the most important factor in the plant because the people on the production lines were working with sensitive explosives, and any carelessness or any mistake could create a horrific explosion which would have cost lives, would have delayed production, just would have been a dreadful thing to happen. We're dealing with high explosives all the time, some of which was extremely sensitive, so sensitive that they didn't dare manipulate the containers by hand. They had to do it remotely.
But, as with every human endeavor, accidents do happen. The chances are even greater when working with high explosives. All too abruptly, an accident would remind everyone just how dangerous their job was. To Ken McCrae, an accident tragically struck at one of his co-workers.
The girl had worked for me and asked if I could get her onto this day shift where they prepared the powder. It's in a different building. And asked if she could get on there because her husband was in the Army, and she had a small child and she wanted to be able to be home and at night. So she'd still be able to work that way, you see, and then be home at night. So I did persuade them to let her go on this job, and it was powder preparation. Now, I don't know what caused it, but I do know that they had a vacuum cleaner, and thinking of it afterwards, I know a vacuum cleaner has got little sparks all the time. And in this place, it did blow up, and she was one, and she was burned to death. And so was the man that was there, too. And he got up, the foreman that was on ahead of me told me that this man had got up, and he said all that was left on him was like a G-string. And he had walked across from this powder preparation building over to where the first aid was in our building. And they got him on a stretcher there and took him out. But he died. He couldn't live like that.
The job of the plant hospital was not only in treating the few who did suffer terrible accidents, but also in preventative medicine for those handling dangerous and poisonous explosives. Handling TNT could be toxic. One woman who had a rather bizarre, albeit harmless, side effect was Kelly Bowen.
Well, every month, the end of every month, they'd have a little roster up inside the department door, and you'd look. If your name was up that day for blood tests, you'd go and just go into the lab and have a couple of needles, one in the thumb and one in the wrist. And this whole time I'm praying there's not going to be any TNT poisoning in me, that I have to be transferred, because that's the last thing I wanted, was to be transferred out of TNT. And I never ever did. The whole time I was there, I was in TNT, and nothing ever came of my blood tests. They just always came out okay. And my hair turned red instead. A very beautiful red. And then when I went in the Army, it was a beautiful color to go with the uniform. And guess what? When my children came along, I had 2 red-headed daughters.
After the break, DIL gets a name, and the town of Ajax becomes a community.
There were churches built, schools built, so you had the nucleus of a town when it was finished.
Hello, I'm Greg Grimes, Program Manager for Maclean Hunter Cable TV. We sincerely hope that you're enjoying our production Ajax the Warriors, and we hope that it becomes a valuable history resource tool for the town of Ajax. This video was produced to commemorate our 25th anniversary in the town of Ajax, and we hope you'll join us as we celebrate together.
By early 1942, DIL had a population of 3,000 people. The small post office in the village of Pickering was being swamped with mail. The management at DIL decided they should have their own post office, but a name was needed to send the mail to. In the end, they decided that a contest was needed to name the community.
Through a contest that was published in the local news at that time, and there was a small prize for it. I don't just recall what the prize was for it, but one of the men in the assistant safety director, I think is the man who decided or submitted the name Ajax because of the recent action of the HMS Ajax and Achilles in Exeter in sinking the Graf Spee, or at least they didn't sink it. The ship was scuttled, but they prevented it from leaving Montevideo, and they would have sunk it had it come out to continue the battle. And that's the way that Ajax was named, after the very heroic ship HMS Ajax.
Many streets bear the names of the men who fought on the HMS Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter against the Graf Spee in the battle that was England's first victory in World War II. The town of Ajax could very well be the largest living monument to those who fought and died in World War II. Harold Anderson, former DIL production clerk and a veteran of the RCAF, recalls how he heard about the name and what it meant to him.
While I was overseas, they used to send me a copy. My brother, who worked in stores, sent me a copy of the Commando, and I learned that they were going to rename the time after one of the battleships that took place in the war against the Graf Spee, called Ajax. Admiral Harwood was mentioned and honorably honored by having the street named after him, as many others. I thought that the munition plant would not be required anymore, and I thought that instead of become some empty buildings, if it was named after a ship that did honor to the Navy and to the services and to the Allied victory.
As proof of its new identity, a newspaper for the workers at DIL, the Commando, had as its place of origin Ajax, Ontario, 15 years before it was incorporated as a town.
We were quite excited to think, you know, Ajax had a paper out, the Commando, and the first Miss Ajax worked with me in Cordite on line 2, and she didn't want to participate, but with all of us saying, go on, try it, enter it, you know, Irene, and bless her heart, she entered it, and she became the first Miss Ajax, which was very nice. Irene Braley. Yeah, she's very pretty, very pretty. So it was a lot of excitement for line 2, you know, to have the first Miss Ajax.
Perhaps the first Miss Ajax could thank her good looks to the wonderful makeover courtesy of the town's only beauty shop. Situated near the women's residence, it was run by Winifred Johnston, Winnie to those who knew her, and in a plant consisting of over 5,000 women, that meant mostly everyone. Jenny Fowler remembers.
Winnie was working in our room and also, and at that time when she was with us, she was telling us how she was a beautician, and they hadn't opened up this beauty salon. They were working on it. So the first person they grabbed a hold of was Winnie. And she was there in no time, you know, starting up a beauty salon. And I'm sure she was there a long time because everyone, well, mostly the girls in the residence naturally went to her, eh? But she was well liked and lots of fun. Very nice. I can still see her now when you know.
The center of activity in the new town was the recreation hall. A wide variety of activities took place there. Outside was Ajax's very first baseball diamond. The first softball champs were loaded with ringers from Western Canada, where baseball was very popular. Inside there was bowling, dancing, and even a show every Sunday night. Bert Shannon, when not setting up bowling pins or selling newspapers at the front gate, would marvel at the master of ceremonies, Harry Brock.
Sunday evenings were a big thing here at that time. We had what they called fireside, which was a bit of a vaudeville show on the stage at the recreation hall, and just local people, you know, get up, sing and dance. And a man by the name of Harry Brock was a man in charge of the recreation hall at the time, and he was, it seems to me that he may have come from vaudeville himself, because he was a real showman. He was, he could go up on the stage and he'd have you in stitches in a matter of a couple of minutes, and he was quite a little showman himself, but he managed to put together a little show for every Sunday evening, a couple of hours. People who lived in the area, and occasionally he'd bring somebody in, you know, singers and dancers and comedians, and we found them quite enjoyable.
We always attended the dances on Tuesday night. They were mostly square dances and whatnot, and Stan Mann and his orchestra played. And sometimes we went on Friday night to the more modern dancing, and there was bowling.
Sandman, I'm sure that there will be a lot of people when we remember him. He was in charge of the men's residences for a number of years, and then latterly, in the last year, he came over and joined us in our security office. And he had his own band and played for the dances and things like that. He was a strong personality, and like I say, he was a musician, and so you can tell that he was a happy-go-lucky person, and he played well and made himself known to the people, and you know, he was an outgoing person. I think that's what I want to say.
But as much as they could try and forget, as much as they tried to enjoy themselves, winning the war was always paramount. Everywhere there were constant reminders, guards at the gatehouse, barbed wire around the perimeter, and thoughts of those far away.
The social aspect of life here at the Defense Industries Limited was probably the same as any Army camp. There were because we did consider ourselves to be part of the war. The shell filling plant was the largest shell filling plant in the British Empire. We knew our importance. If the boys didn't have shells, they couldn't win the war. So absenteeism was something that we just didn't do. We went to work if we possibly could go to work. No one missed shifts unless they absolutely had to. And so for the social life, I think, when you consider that there were a lot more women here than men, maybe the ratio 9 to 1, didn't I do well to find a husband? Yes. The girls danced together. The big bands came in, and Jitterbug was the thing at the time, and they raised the roof and they had a good time. But they were not particularly expecting to be able to link up with one particular person, because the marriageable men were at war. They either were married men at war, or they were single men who had left someone behind with a promise of coming back. And I think that the girls in those days I could be very wrong, but I think the girls in those days were more anxious for that person to come home and more anxious for the next male than they were busy shopping to see if they could find a better item along the way someplace.
Many prayers were probably said quietly every day and every Sunday morning for those overseas. An interdenominational church was built to fulfill this need. It was just another cornerstone in the foundation of a small community. Active in that early church during and especially after the war was Joyce Chalmers.
There was an interdenominational church in North Ajax during the war. Many of the people who came to Ajax from different directions attended churches in Pickering or Whitby. When it appeared that the war was going to last for some years, these people decided they wanted a church of their own here. So one of the people who attended Pickering went into United Church House in Toronto to investigate it, and they went to work and found a temporary building that was put up at different locations, and then when that community had built a new church, this one was taken down and moved on. The gentleman that owned it agreed to loan it to Ajax for the duration of the war. And it was brought out and put on land on Harwood Avenue, south of where Pennyworth is now, and the land was rented from Mr. Heron, who owned all that property, at a reasonable amount, $1 a year. As soon as the building was going up, people came from around and said, "Can I help? What's going on?" And it wasn't any time until that church was organized. It wasn't long until they needed a Sunday school for the children. The first Sunday, 4 children came, and a year later, we had an attendance of 104. It was a center of community activities for the families.
1945 not only meant the end of World War II, it meant the end of DIL. Marie Manning, although happy to see the war finally end, expresses regret at seeing people she'd come to know go their separate ways.
Well, it was kind of a feeling of a job completed. This is the end, and kind of a sadness, I think, as much as anything, because we were losing friends we'd been close to and through the 5 years, and at the end there was just Major Dunn and myself in the office. The others had departed for other jobs, and because there weren't that many jobs around, so they felt they had to get going. We moved down inside, past the gate, down where the new coffee house is there, coffee and donut place. There was a 2-story building there, and we moved all of our furniture and files down there, and then we had the job of packing them.
But not everything could be cleaned up. Many of the buildings had to be destroyed. Lifetime resident and former council member Don Lawrence took part in DIL's demise. He explains why many buildings were burnt and destroyed.
The buildings that were destroyed, especially Capendet and Powell and Tracer Line, is that there was so much powder and highly explosive powder that were used in these areas, so they were burnt. And now all the mixing rooms, TNT mixing rooms for line 1, 2, 3, and 4, they were all burnt out, because when they began to check them, they found that there was quite a buildup in these mixing areas of TNT. Any place that was contaminated, they burnt.
But to those living here, what would become of Ajax? Would people stay, or would it become a ghost town?
The people got talking, well, it's going to be a ghost town. You should, look elsewhere. Think about going back to Brighton, and we decided to stay. And I'm glad we did. There wasn't much here, but it was just like a big family. Everybody knew, and if you were in trouble or you needed help, just about everybody in town was there to help you.
There was a bond that was never broken among some of the workers. They became friends, and the friendship has lasted all their lives. Others remained here after the war was over. People who had come from the Maritimes, from Nova Scotia, from Sydney mines, and people from Regina, from Saskatoon, from the little towns in Saskatchewan, came here to work, and a lot of them stayed here and married and raised families. They have grandchildren here now. Bought the homes that the government had built as wartime homes. They bought them and improved them, made them attractive. Yes, there was a great sense of community, and during the time when there was nothing but wartime homes here, there was a very, very strong sense of community.
If not for this strong sense of community forged here at Defense Industries Limited, there would be no Town of Ajax. DIL and its people gave Ajax its identity. Much has changed these past 50 years. Let's hope we never forget where Ajax came from.
The biggest thing that stands out in my mind right now is the transformation from a shell filling plant to the 53,000 people that are now a part of Ajax. That is an almost unbelievable thing in 50 years' time. I don't think there is another community in Canada that can claim the same status as Ajax. Ajax is a most unique town. It's history in a hurry.
Ajax really is a planned community, one of a kind. Even if it was established just for wartime, the village and the activities. As the Defense Industries Limited closed down, the facilities were still here, so they used it as Crown assets. All kinds of goods and machinery came from other war plants, and they were sold off here. And right away somebody was looking for a new use for the buildings. Toronto University was well aware that many of these veterans coming home were going to want to go to school, and they wouldn't be able to handle huge numbers. The government arranged for veterans to go to school and be subsidized, and this became the best place. The buildings on the lines were turned very quickly into classrooms. The Gatehouse building became Hart House, the chapel, a common room, and the library. The students were, single students were able to live in residences that were already here. Many of them were able to get houses if they had a family and live here. So that part was planned. They also knew that there would come a time when that section of the university would have to be closed. New buildings were built in Toronto. And then it became an industrialized community. This was a wonderful place for industries to come because so much of the land was already serviced. Steam lines, heating plant, everything an industry needed was here. Plus many of the buildings that were in good shape and they could be used. So that part was planned. So yes, it really is one of the unique towns.
We still go out in the evening and drive around town. Sometimes we'll do the same street as we did the last week, and we still find ourselves getting lost in this town where at one time we knew everybody, knew every nook and cranny, and we're still finding areas of the town that we don't know. And I am amazed, and I've often said to my wife, if so-and-so, a friend of mine that I knew in the war years and left this area, if only he could have come back and seen this, you know. If only he could have come back, he wouldn't have believed it. And I don't believe it myself. I mean, I know it's been many years, but it doesn't seem that many to me. I feel that it's almost happened overnight, you know. It's amazing, the growth of this town. I just find it hard to believe. And I love it. I love the fact that it's grown that way.